The 5 members of the Georgia Public Service Commission may not be household names.
I also want to thank our current Public Service Commission Chairman Jason Shaw and former Chairman and Commissioner Bubba McDonald for being with us. I know Commissioner Fitz Johnson, Patricia Pridemore, and Tim Eccles wanted to be here with us today.
But they have a significant say on the bills millions of electricity customers pay.
At the end of the day, this is about hardworking Georgians. This is about keeping their rates stable in a high-cost environment.
Not everyone agrees with Governor Brian Kemp's assessment of how the commission has been doing.
The energy burden in Georgia has gotten unbearable. Families are struggling in rural Georgia and coastal Georgia. I would ask you to just look at our backgrounds, look at our credentials, look at the work we've done.
Now, 2 incumbents are on the ballot this year after a lengthy legal battle, and their challenges are taking aim at the current commission's performance. Voting in the primary is underway now.
You got to have somebody that's going to ask the tough questions. You got to have somebody that's going to say, no, not on my watch. We're going to change things and we're going to move forward, and it's going to be better for the people at the bottom, not the people at the top.
Today, we take a closer look at what the Public Service Commission does and some of the challenges the body is grappling with, like the influx of data centers, increasing costs, and climate change. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In from WABE. So joining us now is Emily Jones, who covers climate for WABE and Grist. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Emily, let's start with a really basic question. Why should people care about the Public Service Commission? And maybe just tell us a bit more of what they actually do.
So answering the question of what they do is going to sound kind of boring, which is why a lot of people are not paying attention to the Public Service Commission. Broadly speaking, they regulate utilities. That means that they're involved in telecommunications, they're involved in natural gas, mostly issues involving pipelines. But their biggest responsibility that has kind of the most impact on the most Georgians' lives is regulating Georgia Power. So Georgia Power is the biggest single power supplier in Georgia. And the commission is in charge of overseeing the rates that they charge customers, as well as their plans, their power plants, how they're making their energy, how they're delivering their energy. And the important thing to remember is that Georgia Power is a monopoly utility. So that means if you live in Georgia Power service territory and you are an ordinary resident in a house or an apartment, you don't get to pick. Georgia Power is your only choice. And so there isn't the competition that exists for other businesses where, 2 gas stations across the street from each other might get into a competition over, who can charge you a little bit less for the gas to try to get more customers. That's not happening with Georgia Power. And so the Public Service Commission kind of serves as that check and balance in lieu of competition. And so what they do is actually really, really important. And if you live in Georgia Power's service territory, they're basically deciding how your energy is getting made and what you're paying for it.
So outline the structure of how this commission is set up and how do you get to be on this commission?
Well, you get elected to the commission. So it's 5 elected members, and those commissioners have to live in designated districts around the state. But unusually, unlike, congressional elections, they are actually elected statewide. So you mentioned, for instance, 2 of them are on the ballot this year. One of them is from the district up in Atlanta. One of them is from the district that covers Savannah here where I am. But all 3 of us get to vote in this election, regardless of where we live, because it's a statewide election. And I should also note, to answer your question of how you get to serve on it, commissioners are elected, although there is a pretty robust history of commissioners actually getting appointed to this commission and then subsequently elected. So, somebody leaves there before their term is over and the governor appoints a replacement, and then that replacement runs as an incumbent in the next election. So the commission is this 5-member body, but it is also basically a state agency. So there's this whole staff of the Public Service Commission. They're the ones that sort of evaluate the issues that come before the commission. There's a segment of that staff that advocates for the public interest. when the commission holds hearings, and the staff also makes recommendations to the commissioners. And that's an important distinction as we continue having this conversation, because you'll hear me mention the commission staff, and it's important to know that that's not the same as the commission itself. So anything that the staff does or recommends, the commissioners still have to approve that. They can change it before they approve it. They can even deny things that the staff puts in front of them. So they sort of have the final say.
Early voting is now underway in primaries for those District 2 and 3 seats on the commission. Before we get to who is running in these races, Emily, there has been a lot of drama over these seats, including lawsuits. Explain why.
There has not been a Public Service Commission election for several years, and that is because there was actually a lawsuit under the Voting Rights Act filed over that system that I explained earlier, where the commissioners have to live in individual districts, but the elections are voted on statewide. That is really unusual. That is not how other elections are run. And a group of Black voters from Atlanta sued over that system, arguing that it was diluting their votes because the district that covers Atlanta covers Fulton, DeKalb, and Clayton counties. And their argument was that those are counties that have a high concentration of Black voters, not just a high concentration of Democratic voters. And they argued that having that commissioner elected by people all over the state, so I can vote for that commissioner in Savannah, folks down in South Georgia, way up in North Georgia can all vote for that commissioner. They argued that diluted the votes of that high concentration of Black voters in Atlanta.
And that has resulted in a commission that right now is made up entirely of Republicans.
That lawsuit took a long time to work its way through the courts. A judge initially agreed with them, and then an appeals court judge overruled it. They took it to the Supreme Court, who declined to take up the case. But that whole process that I just described took several years. And in the meantime, the elections for 3 different seats on the commission actually that would normally have happened were sort of suspended or canceled. It's hard to know exactly what the technical term for it is. But yeah, what that means is that there are 3 commissioners right now who are serving, who are voting on these major decisions about rates and planning and power generation, who would have faced voters at some point in the last couple of years, and instead they continue to serve. Their terms have not technically expired because the way the law is written, the commissioners serve until their replacement is elected, essentially. So their terms have not technically expired, but they have not faced voters as scheduled.
And before we get to who's running, just to put a fine point on this, early voting is happening right now in the primaries. Rahul, how long does early voting last, and when is the actual election day?
So early voting runs through June the 13th, and then the primary day is June 17th. In the one race that has more than 2 candidates, what would happen there is if no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, 2 of them would go to a July runoff, and then election to pick those 2 commissioners would be in November. So Emily, let's talk about the candidates who are running in Districts 2 and 3.
Absolutely. So District 2, which is this sort of swath of East Georgia along the Savannah River, it includes Augusta and Savannah. That district is currently represented by Republican Tim Echols. He has been in there for a couple of terms. He's one of the more prominent members of the Public Service Commission. He's sort of around the state, does a lot of public events about energy issues and things. So he actually has a Republican challenger in the upcoming primary by the name of Lee Munns. He's challenging Echols for his party's nomination. And then whoever wins that primary will face Democrat Alicia Johnson, who's from Savannah, for District 2. And then District 3, which is Fulton, DeKalb, and Clayton counties, has quite a few Democrats running for it. So Daniel Blackman, Keisha Shawn Waits, Peter Hubbard, and Robert Jones are all running in that Democratic primary, which, as you mentioned, if none of them gets 50% of the vote, that'll end up in a runoff. The winner of that primary will face Fitz Johnson, who's the current District 3 commissioner in November. And one note about Fitz Johnson, who is the current District 3 commissioner, he was actually appointed to fill a vacancy in 2021 and kind of started the process of running for that seat again in 2022, but that the general election that year ended up being canceled because of the lawsuit. So he has never actually been elected to the seat in a general election.
Now, you heard from two of those candidates in the show open as Daniel Blackman and Lee Munn spoke at a candidate forum this week. I do want to mention there is an issue around Blackman's candidacy. He's facing a challenge to his residency. As Emily mentioned, District 3 includes Clayton, DeKalb, and Fulton counties. That challenge was heard by a judge who ruled that Blackman was not qualified to run as he did not live in District 3 by November 4th of last year. Look, state law says you have to be a resident for 12 months before Election Day. The judge says Blackman is effectively a Forsyth County resident. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger agreed with that ruling and disqualified Blackman. Blackman is appealing, and we heard from his attorney late Thursday night that an injunction has been granted to keep his name on the ballot as the appeal is being heard. Now, y'all can't see this, but I'm holding up the quote signs with my finger saying keep his name on the ballot. Look, early voting is already underway. This is simply a matter of whether signs will be up in polling locations saying votes for Blackman will not be counted. And down the road, kind of the bottom line of all this, whether the votes for him will be counted in the end.
All right, let's take a break here. This is Plugged In from WABE.
Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE.
I want to turn us now to the work of this commission, and one of the things we hear most talked about in relation to what they do is setting rates. And this year, the commission staff, Emily, has agreed not to hike rates, a deal which still requires sign-off from the commissioners themselves. But the commission has been raising rates in recent years. Just in the last couple of weeks, Governor Kemp was out there touting this plan to keep rates steady. Maybe step back here a bit. Why have rates historically been going up so much?
So the commission and Georgia Power go through this process called a rate case every 3 years. And the rate case is where basically they look at everything that the company is doing, what it's building, what it's buying, and the programs it's running, and this sort of whole look at what Georgia Power does. And then they set rates based on this is how much money we need to take in order to do all of these things. Also set the profit for the company's shareholders within, the band that they agree to. And that's how rates get set. So in 2022, we went through this whole rate case process, and that decision resulted in basically a 3-step rate increase. So rates have gone up January 1st of every year since then, as laid out in that decision. So there's been a little jump in rates every year from that rate case. But that's only half of the bill increases that have happened in the last 3 years. There were also 2 rate hikes during that time to cover the costs of building the new nuclear reactors at Plant Vogtle. As they finally were completed and entered service, there were additional rate hikes that the commission approved in order to cover the costs of building those nuclear reactors. And then there was also actually the biggest increase to customer bills in the last couple of years was not a rate hike, but actually a charge that was added to cover fuel costs. Basically, Georgia Power recovers the cost, which is their term for essentially passes the cost on to customers, recovers it from customers. They sort of predict how much they think they're going to spend on fuel, and then they charge customers for that. And then there is this sort of reconciliation where sometimes fuel was really cheap and they end up sending us a little money back on our power bills. But sometimes fuel costs are expensive and they end up having to add to bills because of that. And so a couple of years ago in 2023, which was right after there was a whole bunch of crazy volatility in natural gas prices, mostly because of the war in Ukraine and other factors, they discovered that they had not collected enough for fuel, and so they added those fuel costs into customer bills. And what that has all meant is that in the last 3 years, Georgia Power customers have seen their bills go up 6 times.
Real quick, I want to add something that I think is important here. We talk about the millions of Georgia Power customers here in Georgia, but there are also millions of EMC customers, electric member cooperatives. They're not covered by the PSC, but they are involved in paying for Vogtle. And so this is also important for those power customers, not just Georgia Power customers. Going back to Georgia Power, you've been watching hours of PSC hearings over the plan on how we generate all this electricity. What stood out to you?
Some of my biggest takeaways from watching these hearings is there is a vast amount of information going in, and sort of being presented at these hearings. So Georgia Power makes its case and puts up a ton of experts who sort of explain why the plan needs to be what Georgia Power says it needs to be. And then all of these different groups kind of cross-examine those experts. That happened a couple months ago. And then now all of these interest groups and public advocacy groups have their own experts up. And some of them are talking about, really big picture issues like questioning the forecast that Georgia Power is making for how much energy it's going to need. And the answers to those questions matter a lot, right? So like the question I mentioned before about the amount of power Georgia Power says that it needs. The company is predicting this massive spike in demand for energy coming from new industrial customers, mostly from data center customers. And several of these sort of expert panels are trying to cast some doubt on that. They're saying, yes, the data center boom is really happening, but we think that the amount of energy you're predicting is maybe a little too high, or, we think it's going to come on more gradually. Those questions make the difference between, keeping a coal plant open or how much energy the company needs to buy, in a power purchase agreement, or all kinds of really vital questions. And, something I always wonder watching these hearings is I'm a reporter who has to watch them, and it's my job. And, I know what's happening, but it's a lot of information and it's a lot of really important questions and really technical detail for me to try to distill as a reporter. And I do always wonder, for the commissioners, they have to distill all that information too. And they have to, take what they're hearing from this huge range of experts and all of this really technical detail and make these really important decisions that affect all of our real lives. And so I guess we all hope as Georgians and as many of us Georgia Power customers that they are, taking the right advice and making decisions that make sense.
So broadly, Emily, then how does the Public Service Commission intersect with your beat, which is climate?
A substantial portion of the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change come from electricity generation. And that has been true for a long time. As long as we've been making electricity, we have been burning fossil fuels to do it. We've been burning coal and later switched to burning natural gas. All of that emits a lot of greenhouse gases into the air and is an extremely significant factor in the climate change that we have experienced so far and the extent to which the climate continues changing going forward. And so what that means is that the decisions that are made by the Public Service Commission about how Georgia Power is going to generate its electricity have major implications for what happens with climate change going forward. I mean, climate change is already happening. We are already seeing the effects of it. But, scientists sort of recognize these kind of divergence points where if we suddenly stopped emitting greenhouse gases right now, we could limit the number of degrees that the planet warms to a certain level. If we keep emitting greenhouse gases at a certain level for the next 10 years, we end up with a higher degree of warming, but we can still sort of cap it off. If we keep burning fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases at current levels, indefinitely, we just keep warming up the climate more and more. And so these decisions that the Public Service Commission makes about when to close a coal plant or whether to keep it open, and that means continuing to burn coal, whether to add more natural gas or more solar. Again, those are decisions about how much emissions we are putting into the atmosphere and for how long, which have incredibly important implications for the future of our planet.
So I just asked Emily there to talk a bit about what the work of the PSC can illuminate about climate policy. Rahul, I want to put a similar question to you. You know, our former editor, Susanna Capelouto, always used to say that Georgia will truly be purple when the PSC races become competitive. I wonder for you, what does the PSC illuminate about Georgia politics?
Two thoughts, Sam. The first one is I go back to the runoffs in January of 2021, the runoffs that led to the elections of Senators Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. People sometimes forget there was a third runoff on there. It was the Public Service Commission. And in that race, the Republican won, Bubba McDonnell. He defeated Daniel Blackman on the same ballot that Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. And to me, what was always interesting about that is that a base turnout, or is it just people, didn't go down to the third race on a ballot? That's what was so interesting about that. And that's why I saw what Susanna Capelouto was talking about, Georgia's purple when the PSC races are competitive. The other interesting thing is what we brought up a couple of weeks ago. Libertarians were able to get higher numbers, and that's how at times they kept their statewide automatic ballot access, is because of those races, and that they were able to turn out numbers for those races. And as Chase Oliver pointed out, that race wasn't on the ballot in 2024, which is why they lost their automatic ballot access. So she's absolutely right. The PSC races are a political bellwether in Georgia.
Rahul, that is fascinating to me because I actually didn't know that about the Libertarian Party. There is this energy independence thread, where if you can have rooftop solar panels, you can be that much more independent from the grid. You can be that much more self-reliant and not, dependent on the grid and on the system. And so, yeah, there is this sort of libertarian vein to the Public Service Commission's work that is really important, and I didn't even know how important it was in the landscape of Georgia politics.
WABE and Grist climate reporter Emily Jones, thank you so much for your reporting.
Sure, thanks for having me.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the dedicated Plugged In feed to subscribe and leave us a rating.
And you can find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10.
Remember, as public media faces an uncertain funding stream, you can support this work with a gift at wabe.org/donate. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali. We'll be back next week.